The French government collapses, plunging EU's second largest economy into turmoil.
France's political upheaval in December offered another glimpse at fractious European affairs.
Germany's under pressure and Volkswagen workers are striking hard.
In my view, we are already in a crisis mood.
Our former model is over. If we follow our classical agenda, we will be out of the market, I have no doubt.
The EU's economy is now
moments in recent years. China has imposed sanctions against 2 European banks. At first glance, a trifle. In reality, a warning. Beijing is showing that it can strike much larger institutions as well. And it all started with Europe itself. It was the EU that first imposed sanctions on Chinese banks for cooperating with Russia. Meanwhile, Washington is increasing the pressure. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is pushing the EU to
Europe is in a fight for a continent that is whole and at peace, for a free and independent Europe, a fight for our values and our democracies, a fight for our liberty and our ability to determine our destiny for ourselves. Make no mistake, this is a fight for our future. Battle lines for a new world order based on power are being drawn right now. So yes, Europe must fight for its place in the world, in which many major powers are either ambivalent or openly hostile to Europe.
Let me ask you a question that is shaking the very foundation of Europe's economy today. What happens when the very markets that Europe has depended on for centuries, Africa and Asia, suddenly decide enough is enough? What happens when the doors that Europe believed would always remain open are slammed shut with the force of a 200% tariff? What happens when the tables turn and those who were once exploited become the ones writing the rules of global trade? That, my friends, is exactly what has just happened. Africa and China, 2 powerhouses of the global south, have delivered the single most devastating economic strike Europe has faced in living memory. With a 200% tariff wall, they have not only choked Europe's industries, they have exposed just how fragile Europe's so-called dominance really is. For centuries, Africa was Europe's playground, stripped of its minerals, flooded with European goods, forced into lopsided deals that left African farmers poor while European corporations grew fat. For decades, China supplied Europe's factories with labor, energy, and resources, while Europe lectured both continents about fair trade. But now, for the first time in history, Africa and China are speaking with one voice, and that voice has declared, the era of exploitation is over. Think about what that means. Germany's auto industry, once the pride of Europe, is on its knees. Farmers in France and Spain, once shielded by European subsidies, are dumping unsold food into the streets. Luxury brands in Italy and France, once seen as untouchable, are watching their African and Chinese customers disappear. Airlines, banks, and retailers across the continent are suffocating. And all of this from a decision that Africa and China made together, a decision that Europe cannot reverse, cannot bribe its way out of, cannot control. This is more than economics. This is psychological. For the first time since the colonial era, Europe is being forced to feel what Africa once felt: desperation, panic, and helplessness. For the first time, European leaders are realizing that they cannot dictate terms to Africa anymore. They must now beg, negotiate, and compromise, words Europe was never used to when dealing with the global south. And let us be clear, this alliance between Africa and China is not built on weakness. It is built on strength. Africa is no longer a resource depot for Europe. It is a booming consumer market, a manufacturing base, an agricultural giant, and a technology frontier. China is no longer a silent factory for the West. It is a global superpower that has chosen to align itself with Africa. Together, they are unstoppable. Together, they have created a wall that Europe cannot climb over, cannot break down, cannot even approach without consequences. So when you see European leaders in panic, when you see protests erupting in Paris, Berlin, and Rome, when you hear European companies crying about unfair treatment, remember this: Africa and China are not playing defense anymore. They are playing offense. They are rewriting the rules of trade. They are forcing Europe to taste the medicine it once forced down Africa's throat. And the question that Europe dares not ask but cannot ignore is this: if Africa and China can do this to Europe, what will they do to America next? Today we stand at a turning point in world history. The global balance of power has shifted in ways no one in Brussels, Berlin, London, or Paris imagined possible. For decades, Europe strutted across the world stage as if it was untouchable, controlling trade, dictating prices, exploiting markets. But now, in an unprecedented move, Africa and China together have drawn a line in the sand. A 200% tariff on European goods has not only shaken the foundations of Europe's economy, but has also exposed the fragility of a system built on exploitation, arrogance, and dependence. This is not just about tariffs. This is about justice. For centuries, Europe plundered Africa's resources, from gold to diamonds, from uranium to cocoa, from oil to coltan. They set the prices, they dictated the rules, they created the system that ensured Africa remained poor while Europe grew rich. China, too, knows the sting of humiliation, having suffered centuries of Western interference, exploitation, and wars forced upon its soil. Today, both Africa and China have said enough. The world is witnessing a seismic reversal. For the first time in centuries, Europe has no control over the rules of trade. Instead, it is at the mercy of Africa and China, the very regions it once dismissed as colonies or cheap labor markets. Imagine the shock in Brussels when European leaders realized they could no longer flood African markets with cheap, subsidized products. Imagine the panic in Paris when French manufacturers saw their exports collapse overnight. Imagine the fury in Berlin when German automakers watched African nations slap a 200% tariff on their cars, forcing them out of markets they once dominated. But it did not stop with Africa. China stood shoulder to shoulder with Africa, declaring that if Europe wanted access to its markets, it too would face the same tariffs. In one coordinated strike, Africa and China dismantled centuries of European economic dominance. Let us break it down. The European Union's lifeline has always been exports. Without access to global markets, Europe cannot survive. Their domestic population is shrinking. Their industries rely on external buyers. Their economies are addicted to selling cars, machinery, pharmaceuticals, and luxury goods abroad. But now those very markets have slammed the door shut. Africa, with its 1.4 billion people, the fastest-growing population in the world, no longer accepts European goods on European terms. China, with its 1.4 billion citizens, has also shut out Europe's easy access. Together, that is nearly 3 billion consumers who have turned their backs on European exports. The result? Factories in Europe are closing. Workers are being laid off in record numbers. Farmers are protesting in the streets because their agricultural exports to Africa have collapsed under the new tariff wall. Luxury brands from Italy and France are watching their profits evaporate. Germany's powerful car industry, once the pride of Europe, has been crippled as Africa and China now prioritize local manufacturing and intra-regional trade. Europe thought it could threaten Africa into submission. It tried to bully African leaders, warning of aid cuts, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. But Africa stood firm. Why? Because for the first time in history, Africa is not standing alone. It has China as a partner. Beijing made it clear, if Europe retaliates against Africa, it retaliates against China as well. This is the shield Africa never had during colonial times, the protection that ensures Europe cannot use its old tricks to maintain dominance. This alliance has turned the global economic order upside down. Africa, once dismissed as a third world continent, is now at the negotiating table as an equal, with leverage that Europe cannot ignore. China, once dismissed as a cheap factory of the world, now dictates the rules of trade. Together, Africa and China have created a fortress that Europe cannot penetrate. Let us be clear, these tariffs are not simply punitive. They are strategic. They are designed to protect African and Chinese industries, to encourage local production, to force Europe to pay fair prices if it wants access. They are a tool of economic independence, a declaration that the days of Europe dumping cheap goods and extracting resources at will are over. Europe's crisis is visible everywhere. In Spain, farmers are destroying crops because they cannot find buyers outside Africa. In Germany, thousands of auto workers have lost their jobs because African nations and China now demand their cars at prices Europe cannot afford to sell. In France, luxury fashion houses are sitting on mountains of unsold goods because the wealthy consumers of Lagos, Johannesburg, Nairobi, and Beijing are no longer willing to pay inflated prices for European labels when they can buy high-quality African and Chinese alternatives. Meanwhile, Africa is booming. The tariffs have sparked an industrial revolution across the continent. African farmers, once crushed under the weight of cheap European imports, are now thriving. African factories, once sidelined by European monopolies, are running at full capacity. African entrepreneurs, once ignored, are now building brands that compete with and outperform their European rivals. In partnership with China, Africa is building roads, railways, ports, and industrial zones that ensure its goods are competitive and its markets are connected. This is what terrifies Europe the most, not just the tariffs, but the vision behind them. A vision of Africa that is self-sufficient, independent, and aligned with global powers like China rather than chained to Europe. A vision where Africa sets the rules, decides the prices, and holds the power. A vision where Europe is forced to beg for access rather than dictate terms, and do not think the rest of the world is not watching. Latin America sees what Africa has done, and it is considering similar measures. Asia beyond China from India to Indonesia is studying the model. Even in the Middle East, nations are rethinking their relationships with Europe. The global south is rising, and Europe is sinking, trapped by its own arrogance and outdated worldview. The truth is this: Europe built its wealth by controlling Africa and exploiting Asia. Without those regions, Europe is weak, and now both regions have turned against it. That is why the European economy is collapsing. That is why the euro is in freefall. That is why European leaders are in panic meetings day after day, searching for solutions they cannot find. The era of European dominance is over. The future belongs to those who produce, not those who exploit. The future belongs to Africa and China, to those who build partnerships, not empires. The 200% tariff is not just a number. It is a declaration of independence. It is a revolution written in economic policy. Europe must now face the reality it created. Centuries of theft, arrogance, and exploitation have finally caught up with it. Africa and China have crushed the very foundation of Europe's power, its control over global trade. And from this day forward, the world will no longer bow to Europe. Instead, Europe must bow to the new reality. Africa and China have risen, and they will never again be dictated to. As we continue to unfold the magnitude of what has just happened with the Africa-China 200% tariff, we must dig deeper into how this single coordinated strike has not only shocked Europe but has systematically dismantled its industries sector by sector. This is not a temporary storm that will pass. This is a structural earthquake that has permanently redrawn the map of global economics. When Africa and China announced the tariffs, European leaders scoffed at first. They thought Africa would eventually buckle under pressure. They assumed China, though powerful, would not risk jeopardizing its ties with Europe, a major export market. But reality hit them harder than they ever imagined. In less than 12 months, Europe has entered an economic crisis that its leaders are desperately trying to mask, but the cracks are too wide to hide. Let us begin with Europe's so-called crown jewel, its automotive industry. Germany, France, and Italy prided themselves for decades on producing cars considered the standard of quality worldwide. Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen, Peugeot, Renault, Fiat, Audi, these names carried prestige. But prestige does not pay when tariffs of 200% suddenly price their cars out of Africa and China. For decades, Africa's growing middle class bought European cars as symbols of wealth and status. China's rising consumers once flocked to German showrooms. But today, those markets are gone. Africa is producing its own vehicles, built to suit African roads, climates, and needs. Partnerships with China have brought in technology transfer and affordable financing to build plants in Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, and Egypt. African-made vehicles are not only cheaper but are also tariff-protected, ensuring their dominance at home. In China, electric vehicle companies like BYD, NIO, and XPeng have seized the opportunity to bury European competitors. Tesla, once a giant, has been forced to cut prices, while German automakers beg for subsidies to survive. The result? Tens of thousands of European auto workers have lost jobs. Towns once thriving on car plants are turning into ghost cities. The pride of Germany's economy has been shattered not by war, not by recession, but by Africa and China saying, "We will no longer be dumping grounds for your overpriced cars." Now let us turn to agriculture. Europe long exported its food products into Africa: wheat, milk powder, frozen chicken, wine, and processed foods often subsidized to undercut local African farmers. For years, this destroyed African agriculture, keeping farmers poor while Europeans boasted of feeding the world. But with tariffs in place, those days are gone. African farmers are finally free to compete, and they are winning. In West Africa, rice production has soared. In East Africa, dairy cooperatives have flourished. Southern Africa now supplies poultry to regional markets instead of relying on frozen imports from Europe. The same story repeats across the continent. Local industries, once crushed, are now thriving. European farmers, meanwhile, are in chaos. In France, farmers are blocking roads with tractors, demanding government bailouts. In Spain and Italy, mountains of unsold fruits rot because they cannot access African and Chinese markets. Europe thought its agricultural dominance was eternal. It was not. Next is luxury. France and Italy built empires on fashion, perfumes, wine, champagne, and handbags. They relied heavily on wealthy consumers in Africa and China. From the glittering streets of Lagos to the high-end malls of Beijing, European luxury brands once reigned supreme. But with tariffs, those brands have been dethroned. African designers, once sidelined, are now celebrated. Lagos Fashion Week, Johannesburg Fashion Week, Nairobi's Design scene they are thriving. China's luxury industry, too, has risen, creating homegrown alternatives that match or even surpass European quality. The psychological blow to Europe is immense. Luxury was not just about money. It was about cultural dominance, to see Africans and Chinese proudly wearing, producing, and exporting their own brands while European boutiques sit empty is a humiliation Europe never anticipated. And then there is energy. For decades, Europe relied on African oil, gas, and uranium. Though Africa did not impose tariffs on raw resources, it imposed new conditions. Resources would no longer be exported without value addition. That means Africa is refining its own oil, producing its own gas, processing its own uranium. With Chinese investment, African nations are building refineries, nuclear plants, and LNG facilities at unprecedented speed. Europe, once the master buyer, now finds itself at the back of the line. African resources no longer flow cheaply. Into European markets they power Africa and Asia first. Let us talk about banking. Europe's banks BNP Paribas, Deutsche Bank, Barclays, Credit Suisse thrived for centuries by managing African wealth, often siphoning profits through unfair loans, exploitative contracts, and hidden fees. But today, with tariffs protecting African industries, those banks are losing billions in profits Africa and China have created. Their own financial networks, bypassing SWIFT, trading in yuan and local currencies, leaving the euro behind. African sovereign wealth funds, once sparked in European accounts, are now invested at home, building industries, infrastructure, and technology hubs. European banks are shrinking, panicked, and irrelevant. Tourism is yet another casualty. For decades, Europe marketed itself as the global tourism hub. But with Africa's rising confidence, tourists are choosing destinations in Africa, from the beaches of Zanzibar to the safaris of Botswana, the pyramids of Egypt to the cultural richness of Senegal. Chinese tourists, who once flocked to Paris and Rome, are now filling hotels in Cape Town, Nairobi, and Accra. Tariffs and trade wars have shifted not just economics but cultural flows. Europe's airports are emptier. Africa's airports are busier. We must not underestimate the symbolism of this moment. For centuries, Europe dictated to Africa. Now Africa dictates to Europe. The humiliation runs deep in European capitals. Leaders who once sneered at African are rushed to negotiate, only to be told that the days of one-sided deals are gone. They must pay fair prices, respect sovereignty, and accept that Africa and China together hold the power to grant or deny access. The ripple effects extend beyond Europe. The United States watches nervously, for it knows that if Africa and China can humble Europe, they can humble America too. Latin America is studying the Africa-China model, preparing to impose its own tariffs on Europe and the U.S. The Middle East, long manipulated by Western powers, is realigning towards Africa and Asia. The world order has shifted permanently. And let us remember, this alliance is not built on charity. Africa is not bowing to China, nor is China colonizing Africa. This is a partnership of equals. Africa brings resources, land, and a massive market. China brings technology, capital, and experience. Together, they crush the exploitative structures of Europe. Together, they build a future where neither continent has to beg Europe for survival. For Europe, the future looks grim. Its industries are shrinking, its debt is rising, its people are restless. Its arrogance has caught up with it. For Africa and China, the future is bright. The tariffs are just the beginning. What comes next is a new global order where the global south decides the rules and Europe is forced to follow. So when we ask why a 200% tariff matters, we must see it for what it is. Not just an economic measure, but a declaration of liberation. It is Africa and China saying to Europe, you will never again enslave us with your economics. It is the birth of a new era, one where power no longer flows from Paris, London, or Berlin, but from Lagos, Beijing, Johannesburg, Nairobi, and Shanghai. Europe has been crushed not by war, not by invasion, but by the will of Africa and China to rise. And this is only the beginning.